And joining me now is a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a military veteran himself, and he also attended the NATO summit. It's Republican Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska. And Senator, first of all, thank you for getting up extraordinarily early this morning, although I don't think the sun sets right now where you are. So good morning.
Good morning, Chuck. It's good to be back on the show from Alaska.
Let me start with that question right there. Respond to the president there that he's hoping the rest of this Republican Party, the Senate Republicans, is basically what he's saying, will be able to talk Senator Tuberville out of what he's doing, considering that the House has sent over a bill with amendment on it. Isn't it fair to say this is in the legislative process and what Senator Tuberville is doing is now unnecessary and harmful?
Well, I hope we get a chance to talk about the NATO summit, but let me address that. The president, a lot of my Democratic colleagues are talking about this as a big national security issue. I think we should be clear. The biggest national security issue from my perspective, Chuck, is the Biden administration is continuing to put forward defense budget cuts during what everybody and the president agrees with this, so does the Secretary of Defense, thinks is the most dangerous time since World War II, right? The budget for next year is going to take us below 3% of GDP spending. That's the lowest level in almost 70 years. So to me, that's the biggest national security threat and readiness threat we have facing us, and that's something the president needs to address directly. Now, to Senator Tuberville, as you know, every senator has the right to place holds on nominees on an issue of policy importance. I certainly have done this myself. I'm here in Alaska right now. I had a hold a couple of years ago on the Secretary of the Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army, to get them to change the position when they were going to remove a brigade combat team, airborne brigade combat team from Alaska. I know my friend Tammy Duckworth is going to be on your show next. And look, she's a war hero. Very few Americans have sacrificed for their country like she has. But Senator Duckworth has had the exact same hold that Tommy Tuberville does a couple years ago on generals to be promoted. Here's the bottom line, and I think you're getting at it, and I think we're getting closer here. Every single one of these kind of holds, 99% of them, get resolved through compromise. And what needs to happen, Secretary of Defense, Senator Tuberville, Chuck Schumer, need to sit down and have that path. The good news is, and I've encouraged this, you may have seen Secretary Austin reached out to Senator Tuberville a couple days ago. I appreciate Secretary Austin doing that. But I think we're going to be debating the NDAA in the Senate the next 2 weeks. To your point, I think there's going to be opportunities to get to that compromise like we have on all these kind of holds that happen regularly in the Senate.
All right, I do want to get back to the NATO meeting. You were there. I want to talk about the number of mentions of China in the communique. It went from one last year in Madrid to, I think, over a dozen mentions here. Look, is NATO expansion into the Asia arena inevitable over the next 2 decades?
Oh, I think it is. And I think it was a positive summit. I think there was a lot of progress. It wasn't just the mention of China several times, almost 20 times on my count. But, Chuck, you probably saw the leaders who were there. It was the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister of Australia, the President of Korea. Our Senate delegation had the opportunity to meet with those leaders, and I think that was a really strong signal with regard to NATO. My big message to all the leaders in NATO during the summit, and it's something we talked about with the President, Jake Sullivan, when we were over there, one of the critical issues that we have to keep pushing with regard to NATO is to get the rest of our allies to step up and do their part. We want this alliance, which is one of the most successful military alliances in history, to be strong, to be sustainable. But it's undermined the sustainability of NATO when only 7 of 31 members of NATO currently meet their 2% of GDP obligation for defense spending. And look, that, in my view, has the potential to undermine even support for Ukraine in the near term and longer term, the support for NATO. So we need our other NATO allies to step up. Some are doing it. Sweden's joining, as you know. They're going to hit 2% right off the bat. Some are laggards. Canada is barely above 1%. It's unacceptable. Right. And we drove that message home. By the way, in a bipartisan way, in every meeting we had.
I want to stick with NATO here very quickly. Do you give President Biden credit for NATO expansion? I mean, Sweden and Finland, nobody saw that coming 4 years ago.
Yes, I do. And look, I give President Biden credit for keeping the unity of NATO, revitalizing NATO, as your opening piece did, as setting out the framework for this war of aggression, which was we're going to provide significant military assets and intelligence, but we're not going to commit U.S. troops. So I give him credit for that. Where I don't give him credit, and you and I have talked about this, is in two areas. One, this slow rolling and self-deterrence that we've had, the administration's had, with getting the Ukrainians the weapon systems that they need. You know, the list is very long. Last time I was on this show, by the way, with you and Jake Sullivan, we talked about the F-16s. I predicted they're eventually going to do it, but it's taken too darn long. That's exactly what happened. And then the other issue, I already mentioned
with
it,
the defense
is
spending,
we're cutting defense spending, and when it's a very dangerous world. Everybody agrees we should not be going below 3% of defense spending. You know, the current budget shrinks the Army, shrinks the Navy, shrinks the Marine Corps. That is the wrong signal to send.
It is up in raw dollars. It would be, but I don't want to get into that. We can debate what cuts are like in Washington. People have a different view. I want to ask you something George Will wrote very quickly here. He wrote this: Vladimir Putin's fifth column is not in Kyiv, but in the Trump-DeSantis faction of the Republican Party. Putin has two hopes for a less than completely mortifying rescue from his Ukraine blunder. One is the election of Trump, who's frivolous about national security, compliments his weaklings' admiration for a bully. Putin's other hope is the election of DeSantis. Are you concerned, and should Ukraine be concerned, that the election of Donald Trump could harm our support?
Well, look, in terms of the Republican Party, I think there's some, for elected officials right now, I think there's been some very positive news, hasn't been talked about. You know, there was this debate in the Republican conference in the Senate about cutting off aid to Ukraine. A couple members wanted to send a letter to the president. We debated it. I strongly was opposed to that. 3 Republican senators signed this letter. And that's not very strong. And you just saw the NDAA that was marked up in the House. All the amendments that were calling on cutting off Ukraine aid went down strongly in a bipartisan way. So I think elected Republican officials right now in the Senate, in the House, are still strongly supportive of Ukraine. We need to make sure other allies
but
step
as well,
up
right?
With their 2%
that
commitment. We need to make sure, and I tell the Ukrainians this all the time. Well, I think, there's my point. I think that current elected officials can have a strong impact on whoever the next president is. When President Trump was president, I pressed him on the issue of NATO quite a lot, and so did many other members. I'll tell you one thing President Trump did quite well was press this 2% of GDP issue. By the way, President Biden has been doing that. President Obama did it as well. So I think the current elected Republican leadership in the House and Senate strongly supports NATO, and I think that's the most important thing to look at right now in terms of that issue.
Well, as I said, I really appreciate you getting up very early for us in Anchorage. Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican from Alaska.
Very early. That's okay.
Yes. Or who knows, maybe you stayed up really late.
Good to be on the show, Chuck.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.